The air smelled of wood smoke and ripened grain, and the whole territory seemed to be celebrating, except Eli Mercer. He stood at the window of his cabin, watching the road that curved through the golden fields and disappeared into the tree line. Wagons rolled toward town in the distance, carrying families dressed in their Sunday best, laughing children hanging off the sides. Somewhere down that same road, a stage was due at noon. Behind him, his 6-year-old daughter Hannah arranged dried corn husks and ribbon on the rough-hewn table, humming softly to herself. 2 years. 2 years since fever had taken Sarah, leaving him with a child to raise and a heart too wounded to feel much of anything. Eli had poured his grief into work and his love into Hannah alone. The rest of the world could stay beyond his fence line. "Papa," Hannah's voice broke through his thoughts. "Do you think she'll come today?" Eli's jaw tightened. The mail-order bride. He'd answered that advertisement 3 months ago, not from hope, but from duty. Hannah needed a woman's presence. He needed help with the homestead. Love had nothing to do with it. "Stage is due at noon," he said flatly. "If she's coming, she'll be here." Hannah bounced on her heels. "I hope she's kind and pretty and likes the festival." Eli said nothing. He hoped she was practical and sturdy, someone who wouldn't expect more than he could give. A knock shattered the quiet. Hannah gasped. "She's here." Eli's boots felt heavy as he crossed the cabin. His hand paused on the door latch. He took one slow breath, then opened it. A woman stood in the afternoon light. Her dress was threadbare, patched in 3 places with careful, deliberate stitching. Her shoes were worn through at the toes. She clutched a single carpetbag, her knuckles white around the handle. Her face was pale from travel, but her eyes, dark and completely steady, held no shame whatsoever. Eli's stomach dropped. This was not what he had expected. She spoke his name like both a question and a prayer. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Margaret, your bride." Behind him, Hannah pushed past his legs, her small face lighting up. "Papa, she's tired. Let her in." Eli stood there, staring at the patches on her dress, at the poverty she wore like a second skin. His first instinct was to close the door, not from cruelty but from fear. What had he agreed to? What kind of desperation had driven this woman all the way to his doorstep? But Hannah was already reaching for the stranger's hand, and Eli found he could not move. Margaret stepped across the threshold with quiet dignity, her spine straight, her chin level. No apology lived in her posture. She carried herself like a woman who had decided, long before she arrived, that she would not be ashamed of her circumstances. Hannah tugged at her father's sleeve. "Papa, she needs water. She's been traveling all day." His daughter was already steering Margaret toward the chair by the window, the one that caught the afternoon light. "Sit here, Miss Margaret. This is the best spot in the whole cabin. Papa built this place himself. He's very good at building things." Margaret allowed herself to be guided. She settled into the chair, and for just a moment, one unguarded human moment, exhaustion and relief crossed her face before she gathered herself again. "Thank you, child," she said, her voice softer than Eli had expected. "You have a generous heart." Hannah disappeared and returned with a cup of water, then proudly produced a small plate of festival bread she'd helped bake that morning. Eli recognized the cup immediately. Sarah's cup, the one with the chipped handle she'd refused to throw away. "This was Mama's favorite," Hannah explained, presenting it with great ceremony. "She said it had character." Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she accepted it. "I'm honored to use it." Eli watched from the doorway, arms crossed, saying nothing. He should ask about her journey. He should say something useful. Instead, he studied her. The precise stitching on each patch despite the rough fabric, the way she held the cup with both hands as though savoring the warmth, the steadiness in her eyes when she looked up and found him watching. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "I know this isn't what you expected." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She didn't flinch. "I can explain my circumstances if you'll allow it. Later, when you're ready to hear them." His voice came out harder than he intended. "Hannah, show Miss Margaret to the spare room. She'll need rest after her journey." Hannah beamed. "Come on, Miss Margaret. I helped Papa clean it special." As they disappeared down the hall, Eli turned back to the window. Outside, the harvest festival was in full swing, music drifting faintly on the warm air, laughter carrying across the fields. Life going on, loud and indifferent to the quiet storm inside his cabin. If he was going to send her back, he'd need to decide before the last stage left town. Then, from the spare room, he heard it. Hannah's laughter, bright, genuine, and completely unguarded. A sound he hadn't heard in months. Eli's hands closed into fists at his sides. One day, he told himself, he'd give her shelter through the festival. Then he'd decide. But even as he made the bargain, something had already shifted. Hannah's laughter moved through the cabin like light returning to a room that had been shut too long. Evening settled warm and golden over the homestead. The festival sounds faded with the sun, and the cabin took on its quiet nighttime rhythm. Fire crackling, crickets starting up beyond the window. Hannah sat at the table showing Margaret her collection of bird feathers, explaining each one with the absolute authority of a 6-year-old expert. Eli retreated to the kitchen under the pretense of making supper. He could hear them clearly. "Miss Margaret, can you help me hang my corn doll? Mama always helped me with the harvest decorations." "Of course, little one. Show me where." He heard the scrape of a chair, Hannah's precise directions, Margaret's patient compliance. When he finally allowed himself to look, he saw them at the window. Hannah on her tiptoes, Margaret steadying her carefully as she hung the small corn doll from a hook above the sill. "There," Margaret said. "Perfect." Hannah stepped back to admire it, then looked up at Margaret with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "Miss Margaret, can I tell you something?" "Anything, little one." "Papa doesn't smile anymore." Hannah's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Not since Mama went to heaven. He used to smile all the time. Now he just works and worries." Eli stood completely still in the kitchen doorway. He should interrupt. He should spare Margaret this confession. His feet refused to move. Margaret knelt to Hannah's height and took the child's small hands in her own. "Grief is love with nowhere left to go," she said gently. "Your papa's heart is full of love for you. Sometimes, when we lose someone precious, we forget how to show it. But it doesn't go away. I can see it in everything he does." Hannah considered this with great seriousness. "Do you think he'll remember how to smile again?" "I think," Margaret said softly, "that little girls who ask brave questions often help their papas remember the most important things." Eli turned away from the doorway. He finished supper with mechanical efficiency, his mind nowhere near the stove. After supper, Margaret washed the dishes without being asked. Eli took Hannah to bed, listened to her prayers, kissed her forehead. When he returned to the main room, he found that Margaret had not only cleaned up but quietly mended the torn hem on Hannah's festival apron, the one she'd caught on a fence post that morning. She looked up from her needle. "I noticed the tear. I hope you don't mind." "Fine," he said. He took his coat and walked to the barn. The night air hit him hard, and he welcomed it. He stood in the darkness gripping his workbench, the same bench where he'd once carved wooden toys for Hannah, where he'd shaped the cradle Sarah had loved. His hands had been still for 2 years, his heart even more so. Through the barn's small window, he could see the cabin glowing amber with lamplight. Inside, a woman in rags was tending his home with more care than he'd shown it in months. His daughter was laughing, and he was hiding in a barn. "Sarah," he whispered into the darkness. "What have I done?" The silence gave him nothing back. When he finally returned to the cabin, he found that Margaret had banked the fire carefully and left a single lamp burning low for him. Beside it, Hannah's mended apron was folded neatly on the chair. Eli stood in the quiet cabin for a long moment. For the first time in 2 years, he felt the full weight of his loneliness, not as something permanent, but as something that might possibly be changed. The days that followed settled into a careful, cautious rhythm. Margaret rose early. Coffee was ready when Eli came in from morning chores. She tended the cabin with quiet, unhurried efficiency, patching drafts, reorganizing the pantry, stretching their provisions with the practiced skill of someone who had learned to make very little go a long way. Hannah shadowed her like a small, devoted apprentice. Asterisk Miss Margaret, teach me to make biscuits. Miss Margaret, show me that stitch. Miss Margaret, tell me about Missouri. Eli kept his distance. He ate quickly, spoke in short sentences, found work to disappear into whenever the warmth in the cabin started to feel too comfortable. His walls stayed up, his armor stayed on, and still he noticed things. The cabin felt less empty. Hannah's nightmares, those terrible, helpless dreams where she cried out for her mother, had stopped. Margaret's presence filled spaces Eli hadn't even realized were hollow until something began filling them. One evening, Hannah brought him a small embroidered sampler she'd been working on with Margaret's help. The stitching was uneven and earnest and completely sincere. Home is where love grows. Miss Margaret helped me with the hard letters, Hannah said proudly. She used to be a real school teacher in Missouri, Papa. Did you know that? Eli looked at the sampler, then at his daughter's hopeful face. It's fine work, Hannah. She says I have patient hands. Hannah paused. Like Mama did. The mention of Sarah no longer brought only pain. Something else moved through him now. Something quieter. Something almost like gratitude. That night, after Hannah slept, Eli sat alone at his workbench. Almost without deciding to, his hands reached for carving tools that had gathered 2 years of dust. A block of pine took shape slowly beneath his fingers. A simple flower, 5 petals, a curved stem. His hands were out of practice. The work was rough. He told himself it was for Hannah. But when he set it aside, he found himself wondering whether Margaret would find it beautiful despite its imperfections. The second week brought clear skies and brutal heat, the last gasp of summer before autumn fully took hold. Eli rode out to the north pasture to check on the cattle, leaving Margaret and Hannah to their morning lessons. When he returned at dusk, he found them at the table, heads bent over Hannah's primer. Sound it out, little one, Margaret was saying. You know this word. FR, free freedom. Excellent. You're reading so well. Eli hung up his coat and stood watching. Margaret's patience seemed genuinely bottomless, her praise never hollow or automatic. Hannah glowed under it. After supper, Hannah fell asleep on the rug before the fire, worn out from the day. Eli carried her to bed, then returned to find Margaret mending by the low lamplight, her needle moving with quiet, practiced grace. He should go to bed. He should maintain his careful distance. Instead, he poured himself coffee and sat in the chair across from her. The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable, but waiting. You were a school teacher, he said finally. Margaret's hands stilled briefly. Yes, in Missouri. How did you come to answer my advertisement in such? He paused, searching for a word that wasn't cruel. Such poverty, she finished for him. No bitterness in it whatsoever. He nodded. She set down her mending and folded her hands in her lap. When she spoke, her voice was even and unhurried. My father was a respected man in our town, a merchant. I was educated, taught school for 3 years. She paused. When he died last spring, I discovered he'd left nothing behind but debts. Eli watched her face carefully. He saw the pain move through it, brief and honest, before she composed herself and continued. I sold everything, the house, the furniture, my mother's jewelry, everything to settle what he owed. I kept only my integrity. She looked up at him directly. The teaching position was given to a married woman. A widow without family or connections was considered unsuitable. She spoke without a trace of self-pity. It was simply the truth, laid out plainly. I saw your advertisement in the St. Louis paper. A widower with a child, seeking a partner for frontier life. She held his gaze. I could have borrowed fine clothes, Mr. Mercer. I could have presented a more appealing picture. But I will not build a life on a lie. You deserve to know exactly who was standing at your door. A woman who lost everything material and chose to keep her honor instead. Eli sat back, struck quiet. She had chosen honesty over advantage, dignity over desperation. His wife had possessed that same fierce, uncompromising integrity, and it had been the thing he loved most about her. That took courage, he said finally. More than most men I know. Something softened in her expression. Thank you for saying so. They sat together in the warm quiet, and it was different now. Less guarded, more like two people beginning slowly to understand each other. The following day, Hannah fell while playing and cut her knee on a stone. Before Eli could react, Margaret was already there. Calm, gentle, completely sure of herself. She cleaned the wound with careful hands and soothed the tears with soft, steady words, and within minutes had Hannah laughing about her battle scar. Eli watched from across the yard, his throat tight. That evening, he left the carved wooden flower on the kitchen table without explanation. By morning, it was gone. He found it later on Margaret's windowsill, positioned where it would catch the early light. Neither of them said a word about it, but something had passed between them, fragile as new growth but present. The third week brought Eli to town for supplies. He'd barely begun filling his order at the general store when Widow Carson materialized at his elbow, her circle of companions arranged behind her like a Greek chorus in bonnets. "Eli Mercer," she cooed, her smile sharp and practiced. "We've all been wondering about you. Word has it you've taken in your mail order bride." "I have," Eli said carefully. "And is it true," another woman interjected, leaning in, "that she arrived at the harvest festival in absolute rags?" Her circumstances were modest. The widow clucked her tongue with theatrical sympathy. "Such a shame, Eli. Your Sarah came from good family. And now," she lowered her voice to the register people use when they want to seem kind while saying something unkind. "A proper woman would have had means. What sort of breeding produces that kind of poverty? The girl must have been truly desperate. What you've done is practically charity. Think of your daughter. What example does this set?" Eli paid for his supplies and left without another word. But their voices rode home with him. Practically charity. What kind of breeding? Truly desperate. He saw Margaret through their eyes as he drove. Shabby, unsuitable, a woman without family or fortune or standing. Doubt crept in the way cold air finds the gaps in a wall you thought was solid. He arrived home to find Margaret and Hannah in the kitchen making harvest bread, flour dusting both their faces. They looked up with matching smiles when he came through the door. "Papa, we're making Grandma Margaret's recipe. She's letting me do the kneading." "That's fine, Hannah," Eli said flatly. He saw Margaret's smile fade. She read the shift in him immediately. He could tell by the way something careful came back into her eyes. The brief, guarded look of someone who had learned to anticipate rejection. Over the next 2 days, Eli withdrew. He took meals in silence. He stayed longer in the barn. He gave short answers and found reasons to be elsewhere. The careful warmth they'd been building together began, slowly, to cool. Hannah felt it first. Her bright chatter quieted. She watched her father with confused, uncertain eyes. The eyes of a child who senses something wrong but can't name it. On the third evening, Eli stood outside Hannah's door, about to go in for her bedtime prayers, when he heard his daughter's voice through the wood, small and trembling and utterly unguarded. "Miss Margaret, are you going to leave us? Like Mama did?" The words went through him like a blade. Margaret's reply was gentle, but even through the door Eli could hear the strain in it. "I'm here right now, little one. I'm right here." He stepped back from the door. He walked to the barn and stood in the dark, and the widow's polished words fought with everything his own eyes had shown him. Margaret's worth against society's judgment. What he knew against what he feared people would say. Snow, late, unseasonable, stubborn, had begun to fall outside, dusting the harvested fields white. He didn't know how long he sat there before his eyes fell on his father's old Bible, left on the workbench weeks ago. Sarah's ribbon still marked a page, the same page it had marked for 2 years. He opened it with hands that weren't entirely steady. Sarah's handwriting filled the margin beside a verse. Neat, familiar, unmistakably hers. Worth is measured by character, not circumstance. Remember this, my love. She'd written it during their first year of marriage, when he'd worried he wasn't providing enough. She had always seen deeper than surfaces. It had been her greatest gift, and he had nearly thrown it away. His father's voice surfaced from somewhere further back. Asterisk, a man's measure ain't in what he owns, son. It's in what he's willing to give. What was he willing to give? From across the yard, faint but clear, came the sound of Margaret's voice, soft and melodic, singing Hannah to sleep. The melody was unfamiliar, but the tenderness in it was not. Eli rose. He crossed the yard quietly, his boots leaving fresh prints in the thin snow. He entered the cabin and moved through the kitchen, stopping in the shadow of the hallway. Margaret sat beside Hannah's bed, her threadbare dress clean and carefully pressed despite every patch on it. The lamplight was soft on her face as she smoothed his daughter's hair. Hannah's small hand held Margaret's fingers with absolute, unquestioning trust. "Miss Margaret." Hannah's voice was thick with the edge of sleep. "Yes, little one. I love you. Please don't go away like Mama did." Eli stopped breathing. Margaret leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to Hannah's forehead. "Hush now, little bird. I'm right here." Hannah's eyes closed. Her breathing slowed and deepened into sleep. Margaret stayed where she was, still stroking her hair, humming softly in the quiet. Eli stood in the hallway, and everything became clear. This woman had arrived with nothing but herself. No money, no connections, no fine clothes, no borrowed advantages. And she had given everything she had anyway. Honesty over deception, dignity over desperation, genuine love for his daughter, asked for nothing in return. His wife would have recognized her immediately. His daughter already had. And he had been measuring worth by entirely the wrong scale. He stepped back from the doorway, his decision settling into place the way things do when they stop being decisions and simply become truth. Tonight he would prepare. Tomorrow he would speak. He went back to the barn and worked until the sky began to lighten. Not hiding this time, building. His hands moved with a purpose they hadn't held in 2 years. Shaping, smoothing, finishing. When the sunrise came up pink and gold over the harvested fields, he set down his tools and looked at what he'd made. The wooden flower from weeks ago, now complete. Delicate leaves added, the stem curved just right, the whole thing sanded smooth. Beside it, on the workbench, sat a small wooden box. Inside lay a simple ring, and beneath the ring, a folded note in Sarah's handwriting. "For the next woman worthy of your heart, whenever you find her." The coldest part of him had already broken open. All that remained was to open the door. Morning light filled the cabin kitchen as Eli stood at the stove. He heard Margaret's footsteps stop in the doorway. "Mr. Mercer." Surprise moved through her voice. He turned from the stove, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Please sit. Breakfast is nearly ready." She moved to the table with her usual careful composure, though he could see the wariness in it now. He'd put that wariness there, and he knew it. He brought coffee, then eggs, then toast, set before her with quiet, deliberate care. He sat across from her, his heart hammering steadily against his ribs, and looked at her directly. "Margaret," he began. She went still at the use of her name. "I owe you an apology." She waited, her dark eyes giving nothing away, protecting herself the only way she knew how. "When you arrived, I looked at you and saw rags," he said. "I listened to town gossip and let it tell me what to think. And in doing that," his voice roughened slightly, "I failed to see what my daughter saw the moment you stepped through that door. A woman of courage, of integrity, of genuine and uncommon worth." Something moved behind her eyes, hope carefully, cautiously present. "You could have come to me in borrowed finery," he continued. "You could have dressed the part and told me what I wanted to hear. Instead you came in truth, offering exactly who you are. That takes more courage than most people ever find." He paused, steadying himself. "My wife died believing that character matters more than circumstance. I came close to forgetting that lesson." His voice dropped. "Thank you for reminding me." Margaret's composure cracked. Quietly, completely. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she made no move to hide them. Eli reached into his pocket and set the carved flower on the table between them. Then he placed the small wooden box beside it and opened it, revealing the simple ring. "I've watched you these weeks," he said. Your kindness to Hannah, your dignity under judgment, your honesty when dishonesty would have served you better. I see your worth, Margaret. All of it. He looked at her steadily. Your poverty doesn't diminish you. It reveals you. When you lost everything, you kept your honor. There is no fortune worth more than that. He reached across the table and took her hand. The first time he had ever reached for her deliberately, with intention, with full knowledge of what it meant. Her fingers were warm in his, trembling slightly. Will you stay? He asked. Not as an arrangement, not as charity, not as obligation. He paused, the word almost too large for his long-armored heart. As chosen, she understood. She had always understood him better than he'd given her credit for. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Eli, I will stay, and I will spend every day proving your trust was well placed. Her tears fell freely now, not from sorrow, but from the particular relief of being truly seen by someone who had every reason to look away and chose not to. He held her hand and felt something long frozen begin, finally, to move. From the hallway came the sound of small running feet. Hannah burst into the kitchen. She had been listening, of course she had, and stopped in the middle of the floor, her eyes wide and swimming. Papa, Miss Margaret. She could barely get the words out. Does this mean she's staying? Does this mean she'll be my... She stopped, afraid to say the word, afraid to want it too much. Margaret opened her arms. Hannah crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and buried herself in them. I'm staying, little bird, Margaret said into her hair. I'm staying. Hannah's sobs of pure, overwhelmed joy filled the cabin. She reached back for her father with one small hand, pulling him in. Eli wrapped his arms around them both, his daughter and the woman he had chosen, and held on. Morning light poured through the window and fell across all 3 of them like a blessing. For the first time in 2 years, Eli smiled, and his heart, so long sealed shut with grief, opened. Sunday came bright and warm, the kind of autumn morning that feels like a gift before winter arrives to collect its dues. Eli helped Margaret up onto the wagon. She wore her threadbare dress. He'd offered to buy her something new before church, and she declined without hesitation. Let them see who you chose, she'd said quietly. Let there be no pretending. Hannah sat between them on the bench, holding both their hands, forming a small and deliberate bridge. Eli flicked the reins and they moved toward town. The congregation turned when they walked in. The whispers started before they'd made it halfway down the aisle. Eli felt every eye in the room, felt the weight of every opinion people had already formed, and kept walking. He guided Margaret and Hannah to their pew. He sat straight. He held his ground. After the service, Widow Carson appeared as if she'd been stationed there, her expression set into its familiar configuration of theatrical concern. Eli, dear, so lovely to see you out. Her eyes moved to Margaret with the particular efficiency of a woman cataloging faults. And this must be Mrs. Carson. Eli's voice was calm and carried clearly. I'd like to properly introduce my intended wife, Margaret. The widow drew breath, ready. Eli continued before she could use it. She came to me with nothing but her character. I found it worth more than any fortune I've encountered. He let that settle for a moment. That's the truest wealth I know. And if this town measures a person's worth by the quality of their cloth rather than the content of their character. He glanced around the room, unhurried and unafraid. Then this town still has some learning ahead of it. He offered Margaret his arm. She took it, her head high, her spine straight, her dignity absolute and entirely her own. A long silence held the room. Then Mr. Thompson, the blacksmith, stepped forward. He removed his hat and inclined his head toward Margaret with simple, unhesitating respect. Well said, Mercer. We'd be honored to welcome you to our community, Miss Margaret. Any person with sense can see quality when it's standing right in front of them. His wife stepped up beside him and took Margaret's free hand warmly. We'd love to have you for supper sometime. Our door is always open. Others followed, the banker's wife, the schoolmaster, the reverend himself. The tide turned, the way tides do when one person is brave enough to move first. Judgment gave way to generosity. Gossip softened into welcome. Even Widow Carson managed a tight, retreating smile before she found somewhere else to be. The ride home was easy and quiet. Hannah talked about the Reverend's sermon with great authority. Eli and Margaret exchanged occasional glances that said more than either of them needed to put into words. As they came around the bend toward home, Eli drew the horses to a stop. "What is it, Papa?" He was looking at the cabin's front step, where something had caught the afternoon light. He climbed down and helped Margaret and Hannah to the ground. They gathered around the base of the porch, and there, pushing up through the last thin frost still clinging to the earth at the edge of the step, green shoots had broken the surface. Small, stubborn, absolutely certain of themselves. Hannah saw them first and dropped to her knees. "Papa, look, Mama's flowers." She reached out and touched one with a single careful finger. Purple and gold, just beginning to open. Late-season wildflowers that Sarah had planted years ago and that no one had thought to tend. Margaret knelt beside her in the grass, her patched dress trailing against the cold earth. "They've been here all along, little one," she said softly, "just waiting beneath the surface, waiting for enough warmth to help them bloom." Eli understood her perfectly. Hope doesn't die when love is lost. It waits, patient, persistent, stubbornly alive beneath everything piled on top of it, for someone willing to let it grow again. He knelt beside them both. The three of them stayed there for a long, unhurried moment, regarding those small, brave flowers in the thin autumn light. Then Eli stood and offered Margaret his hand. She took it, her eyes meeting his, clear, warm, and carrying a trust that humbled him more than anything else she could have offered. "Welcome home, Margaret," he said. She rose, and her smile was radiant. Not despite her poverty, but entirely independent of it. Beautiful for reasons that had nothing to do with what she owned or wore or came from. "I believe I am home," she said. "Finally, and truly home." Hannah took her father's other hand, and together, three where there had been two, whole where there had been broken, they stepped across the threshold. Inside, the afternoon light lay golden across the table. Margaret's carved wooden flower stood in a cup beside Sarah's Bible, old love honoring new, as it should be. Outside, the late-season wildflowers stood their ground by the doorstep, purple and gold against the frost, small and brave and absolutely sure of spring. Through the window, if you looked, you could see three silhouettes moving through the warm light of the cabin. A father, a daughter, and the woman chosen not despite her rags, but because of the extraordinary worth she carried inside them. Their laughter found the empty spaces and filled them. Home isn't where you hang your hat. The old saying goes, it's where your heart learns to trust again. In a cabin on the Wyoming frontier, where the harvest had come and gone and the first frost was just beginning to find the edges of things, three hearts had found exactly that. Eli had opened the door, and Grace, wearing threadbare clothes and carrying nothing but her integrity, had walked through.